Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We're just kicking off the webinar, and I know those of you in the waiting room are starting to filter in. My name is Megan Petsko, and I am the director here in the Graduate Tax Program. I'm really excited for today's webinar. It's a special one as we have gathered our full-time faculty to present about their courses, their pedagogy, and their experience teaching in our online and in-person classes for the Graduate Tax Program. You are automatically muted as when you join the webinar as part of this service, and automatically your cameras are turned off, so you don't have to worry about doing any muting or anything like that. We do encourage any questions you may have to be sent in throughout the duration of the webinar. We have questions that we'll be going over with our panel in a little bit, but should something come up and you have a question you'd like to ask, you'll see a chat box and a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And please feel free to send any remarks or comments, questions through there, and we'll make sure that we get to them during today's session. So from here, I am actually going to pass it to our faculty director, Professor Joy Mullane. Professor Mullane is a professor of law here at the Charles Woodruff School of Law at Villanova and teaches in both our JD program of full-time day law students and also our graduate tax program. And she's going to give a program overview and then introductions of our faculty panel, and we'll take it from there. So Professor Mullane, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, Megan. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about the program in general, and then move us along to introducing my colleagues and to the Q&A session. So our program is rather unique and market in that we offer 2 degrees, but they're not separate tracks. We offer degrees for both lawyers and for non-lawyers. Lawyers are awarded at the end of their time an LLM, a Master's of Laws in Taxation, and non-lawyers are working towards earning their MT, a Master of Taxation. But I think it's really important to highlight one of the unique and special features of our program is that lawyers and non-lawyers are in the same classes. They have the same core required courses that they need to take to complete their degree. And as I really like to highlight, one of the benefits when they're learning sort of side by side is that lawyers and non-lawyers are learning not only with each other, but from each other, since their educational backgrounds lend them to have slightly different perspectives. I find that the classroom is discussion, whether in person or online in a discussion board, is really enriched by those differing perspectives. So along with the 2 degrees, we also offer 3 specialty certificates. Sometimes we have those who come to our program just to earn a certificate. Some earn a degree and a certificate. Our areas of specialty for the certificates are employee benefits, estate planning, and state and local tax. While we don't have certificates in some of the business or international areas, we certainly have a robust course catalog that offers many electives in the area of business tax and international tax. One of the principal differences between the LLM and MT degrees is that due to Department of Education requirements, you need more credits to earn the MT degree than the LLM, which is really more opportunities to take electives as the core requirements remain the same. Those certificates are a set 5-course package, and so those can be completed on a more timely basis. So that's sort of the overview of our offerings. And one of the things that we'll be talking a lot more about today is more about how our program came into being and how it's evolved over time and where we are now. And in general, we would say that our approach to learning really comes from the perspective that people learn best when they are actively engaged in their learning, when you're not just sitting and being lectured to, as I'm doing a little bit of right now, but that you're really engaged in the learning process by working with the tax law, the tax regs, other tax authority, and you're engaging with them in the context of either real world or slightly contrived hypotheticals, depending on the context, and that you have this opportunity to engage with real world fact patterns, apply it to tax authority, and to learn and grow through that process. And that to really emphasize the learning aspect of it, there's a number of opportunities to have this engagement and get immediate feedback, to have a sense of how well you are doing, how well you are grasping the material in ways that are, we would say, no or low stakes. And another way of putting that is that it doesn't really affect your grade. These are just opportunities to learn and grow. And we have other assessments that are worth more towards your grade. And we'll certainly be talking more about that today with my colleagues. And so the last thing that I want to highlight is that another important component of our program is that it is really flexible. We work on an 8-week course cycle. We have classes year round. That means we have 6 terms. And this flexibility allows students to adjust their schedule according to what's going on in their personal or their professional life. That we would say there's a lot of opportunities to step on and off the carousel of the sort of ever revolving opportunity to take courses and to sort of time things appropriately with what works well with your life. With the 8-week course format, that means that you're taking 7 weeks of classes and you have a final exam in an 8th week. And what we have really done is just condensed the courses, but not the coverage, whereas historically semesters run over a 14-week period and students in our program might take 2 classes concurrently at the same time over the course of 14 or so weeks. Now there's this opportunity to still take 2 courses if one wants in that same time frame, but instead of taking them concurrently, you take them consecutively, and you have this opportunity to really dive in and focus. And last but certainly not least, a key cornerstone of our program, something that was really important, is that while certainly there is a lot of online content, sort of preloaded content and opportunities to engage in the online environment, that every week there is a live synchronous class, an opportunity to engage directly with your professor and with your classmates as part of the learning process. And with that abbreviated overview, I'm happy to turn to letting my colleagues introduce themselves as we then sort of move into the Q&A portion of this webinar, and through that have an opportunity to continue to discuss the approach to learning and what taking classes is like at Villanova's graduate tax program. So I'm going to turn first to my colleague, Professor Les Book, to please introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Les Book. As Joy just mentioned, I've been at Villanova for a long time. I've been a faculty member in the law school and in the graduate tax program for over 20 years. And so I started initially working in our law school's tax clinic as a director of our tax clinic. And then after doing that for a while, I became director of the graduate tax program and worked with Professor Mullane in starting our online program as well. So I have deep experience with teaching in the online, designing classes in the online setting, and I still teach half-time in the graduate tax program and half-time for teaching day students in the law school. So I'm looking forward to talking about my work in the program.
All right, and next up, my colleague, Professor Harvey.
Well, thank you, Joy. I'm Dick Harvey. Hello to everyone. Welcome, hopefully, to the program. My title is the Distinguished Professor of Practice at the law school. And what distinguished means is I'm old. So I've been practicing tax for over 45 years now. And my career started out, I know we've got both lawyers and non-lawyers in the class. My career started out as an auditor with Price Waterhouse back in the middle 70s. Then I saw the light, transferred to the tax practice. I then had the opportunity to go down during the Reagan administration. I was the senior accountant in the U.S. Treasury Department Office of Tax Policy. So I got the opportunity to negotiate, write, and then implement the 1986 Tax Reform Act. And then I came back to Price Waterhouse as a partner in the New York office and worked for 20 plus years with all the major financial institution clients. I then got another opportunity to go back into government as the senior advisor to the IRS commissioner towards the end of the Bush II administration, and then we carried over into the Obama administration. So I worked on a whole plethora of issues in government the second time. And then upon leaving government about 11 and a half years ago, I joined the full-time faculty of Villanova Law School and have been teaching both in the ground program and the online program initially, and then for the last several years since I now have moved full-time to Florida, I now teach solely in the online program. So that's sort of my background. I also do a lot of speaking, do a lot of articles, and then I've also been called to testify in front of Congress on several occasions. But that's sort of some background on myself. And Joy, do we want to roll right into my first class?
I was going to toss this over to Megan, who is the director of the graduate tax program, and she keeps everything running smoothly, both through the programs and through webinars. So,
yeah, absolutely. Perfect timing, and that would be great. I have our slides back up so Professor Harvey can talk about the first course that you take in our program for both LLM and MT students, Survey of Tax. So Professor Harvey, I'll pass it to you to go over this slide.
Well, thank you, Megan. The Survey of Tax course that I developed, and I developed it about 7 or 8 years ago, and I developed it after I'd been teaching the tax policy course in the program for many years. And I was surprised because I was usually getting students at the end of their academic career, and I was surprised that they didn't have exposure to certain areas of the tax law. So I was able to convince the rest of the faculty to create a Survey of Tax course, which to the best of my knowledge is unique throughout the country. I'm not aware of another law school or for that matter, Master's in Tax program that has it. But it's a unique course that I've written a textbook for. I provide the textbook free of charge. It's an online textbook for students. And it's really designed, as this slide indicates, to introduce students to a wide range of topics. And you see them listed here. There's lots of different topics. Now, it's not unusual that some students, we get a lot of students that do have some experience in, say, individual taxes, or maybe wealth tax, or maybe corporate tax, but it's very rare that they've got experience in all of these. And the course goals, as indicated here, are really 3 from my perspective. The first is, and this is, I think, the single most important skill that a tax professional can have, is to be able to recognize issues. Because if you don't recognize an issue, then you're in big trouble. You're probably going to be sued for negligence at some point during your career. So recognizing that there might be an issue, to me, was what saved my bacon, so to speak, many times during my career. I didn't necessarily know the answer, but either I could go out and do the research, or I could get someone that was an expert in the area to provide the answer. So one of the primary goals of my Survey of Tax course is to expose you to a lot of different issues, a lot of different areas, and sensitize you to when you might have an issue so that you can then get an answer to that issue. Another goal, as this slide indicates, is to understand what your career options are. Some students come in thinking, well, they want to study, let's say, individual tax, but maybe after hearing about state and local tax and international tax or some other area, they think, well, maybe I'll spend some time looking at those particular areas. So the course is also designed to introduce you to many different areas. So you might say, hey, I like this area, or maybe, hey, I don't like this area, as the case may be. And then the last course goal is to really understand how much the political process gets involved in the tax law. I know a lot of, especially non-lawyers, they think the tax law should be, very neat and orderly and logical. And I guess I'm here to tell you that it's anything but neat, orderly, and logical. It's influenced by the political process, and you have exceptions to the exceptions, the exceptions. And I think the sooner you understand that and then can you read the tax law, taking that into consideration, you'll stop pulling out your hair. Because I know when I first started my career, I was just flabbergasted at how many exceptions to the exceptions there were within the tax law. Then as far as learning methods go, many different learning methods. As I mentioned already, there's a highly tailored textbook that I make available for students for free. There are 30 or so pre-recorded video lectures of anywhere between 10 and 20 minutes that cover sort of the basic material. Then we have a live weekly session every Thursday evening for an hour and a half, and that's an interactive session where I'll put up slides. You can see a video of me speaking. Then if you have a question or a comment, you raise your hand. I'll recognize you. Your video will pop up next to mine. We can go back and forth and discuss it. And then when you're done, you turn off your video and your audio. I think the live Zoom session, a lot of students really find that a distinguishing factor of the Villanova program, because there are a lot of programs out there that don't have live sessions. They're all what we refer to as asynchronous, which means you're basically watching just canned videos. Now, we do have some canned videos. As I indicated, we've got 30 or so canned videos in my class, but we also have every week an hour and a half live session where we get to discuss things back and forth. Then we also, in my class, have an extensive use of discussion board. Discussion board is sort of a glorified chat room. And what I'll do is each week I'll post 3 or 4 questions, and there isn't necessarily a right answer to the question, but then students can provide their views on one of those questions each week. And then we go back and forth and discuss it. And I think students find this a very valuable portion of my class, because the students have many different backgrounds. And this is an opportunity where, let's say you're somebody that has tremendous experience in the individual area, you'll be able to contribute some things to your other students. And frankly, sometimes I learn things from students as well. And then in other situations, you might not be contributing, but you might be learning. So the discussion board is a great way to share experiences and share views on things. And then lastly, I make available sample assignments and suggested answers, because every week, or certainly after the first week, so weeks 2 through 7, there are assignments due. They're fairly simple assignments that can be done usually in anywhere from a half hour to an hour. But I provide sample assignments with suggested answers, and students find that very useful as a study tool and a learning method, because the actual graded assignments are not that dissimilar from the sample assignments. And then finally, in the survey of tax course, the grades are composed of 3 things. There's discussion board, graded assignments on a weekly basis, and then the final exam. So that's just a quick overview of the survey of tax course. But again, most important thing from my perspective is students need to be able to recognize issues, because if you don't, you're going to get yourself in trouble during your career.
Thank you, Professor Harvey, for giving us that overview of how the first course works. I think that sets the foreground for me to move to our next slide, and I'll leave this up for asking both Professor Mullane and Professor Book questions. So Professor Book, I'll go to you first. When you and Professor Mullane, began the initiative to create an online program offering of the graduate tax program, I know from, interacting with both of you that academic excellence was a hard requirement in transitioning to, the distance learning platform. What steps did you take to ensure that academic excellence would carry from the ground program to online?
Yeah, it really is. It's a key question, and I think what helps distinguish Villanova's program from some other programs, in that while I've been teaching for a long time, and Professor Mullane has been teaching for a long time. We did not have extensive experience in the online environment when we when we decided to to take the time to think about moving, or at least having an offering in the online space. So what we decided to do was really to meet with experts who had spent time thinking about how to design and teach in an online setting. And those experts were not necessarily connected to law or tax, but they were deeply steeped in pedagogy and instructional design, and allowed us to think about how we could transfer what we, our hallmarks of excellence in our ground program to an online setting. We had spent a lot of time really, strengthening our academic environment in our classes in the building that revolved around things like continuous use of problem method, an extensive use of low stakes assessments to supplement a cumulative final examination, and heavy lecture lecture in a classroom setting. And some of those things transfer better than others in the online environment. So we basically decided to think about, well, how can we teach best and design classes best using our core principles that we worked hard in designing in our ground program. And part of that, as is on the slide, really related to a combination of extensive asynchronous content, which allows people to apply the concepts and statutes and regulations that are associated with particular classes across basic comprehension questions and questions that we call bridge problems that allow people to apply concepts to different fact patterns. All backstopped, as Professor Harvey noted, by a weekly requirement to have a synchronous or live session where the students and faculty can come together in a weekly format to ensure that faculty and students can interact in a live real-time setting. Then to have kind of regular low stakes quizzes that students can be able to basically demonstrate their competence, and more importantly, perhaps, faculty can reach out to the extent that students are struggling or may need some additional assistance. So it's an iterative process that allows kind of an engagement throughout the semester, throughout the class, and it allows us to combine, I think, the best of what we do in person in the ground classes with the technology that's available for an online setting, and for today's world where people's personal and professional lives are such that sometimes you need to do things on your own time, and so our program really combines kind of the best of a ground setting and as well as some of the attributes of an online program.
Thank you for that, and for going through the foundation that both you and Professor Mullane established, and that has carried through not only with our core courses that you first established, but has been replicated in our electives as well by our other instructors and adjunct instructors. And speaking of core courses and electives, Professor Mullane, building off of what Professor Book just talked about, you both co-developed, Tax 1 and our Tax 2 courses together for the graduate tax program. And you also designed the Foundational Wealth Tax elective course, all of which are very substantive, material. What was your approach to covering such robust topics in an 8-week format that you teach both online and in person using that calendar?
Well, we, certainly gave it a lot of thought, incorporating, a good measure of the conversation that we've already had. And one of the starting points is thinking about what are the basic goals, the core concepts, the learning objectives that you want every student to sort of leave the class having achieved. And, once you know what your course goals are and what the learning objectives are, both on sort of the, the overall course, but also on more specific topics, you can start thinking about, what is the best way to deliver that content? And you think about it from a variety of perspectives. One perspective is thinking about what topics sort of naturally fit together, right? What's a sort of good overall progression over the course of a term. I give a lot of thought to, in particular, sort of the load of each week. There's a big difference between one of the big differences between the survey tax class and then a lot of the substantive tax classes is that the more specific classes, you're doing this deep dive. Now, I am the biggest fan of the survey of tax class, and even for our, JD students who are thinking about tax and not sure if they're ready to make a commitment to a grad tax program, I'm always telling them that they need to go to a survey of tax. It gives you that big picture perspective that Professor Harvey was talking about that is so important to be able to recognize issues across a variety of key tax areas. And, you need that big picture perspective and you need that sort of basic grounding in all of these areas of tax. And I think it's great to see where there's some real alignment amongst sort of the different, key areas. But when you're doing the deep dive, it's a different type of workload and a different level of engagement with the material. And some topics are just intense and more challenging than other topics. And so I try where I can to pair up more intense topics with, topics that are a little bit less intense, or if, as happens in particular with wealth tax, there are some weeks that are just going to be intense weeks because of the nature of the material that we have to deal with. And I know this happens in partnership tax as well, where we are commonly advising students to think carefully about when they take partnership tax, just because the nature of the material makes it more challenging. And so then I'll try to back that up to a week that's a little bit less intense, sort of being mindful of the workload, and then staying focused within each week again on what the objectives are. And that's where I think the basic pedagogy that we use with the foundation questions and the bridge problem sort of really comes into play to think, what is the basic foundational concepts that one must master to move on to the more advanced concepts, even within a topic. And so there's this real sort of scaffolding throughout each individual week, where we start. The starting point is usually actually an introductory lecture to the material, the type of lecture you might get if you were just coming to sort of a more traditional model of an in-person class, where you come in and maybe the professor starts with, like, today we're going to talk about, and we'll start with that sort of introductory lecture and with some highlights of here's things to look out for, and here's some basic introductory concepts, and that sets the stage for students to then go do some of the background reading the statute, reading the regulations before they come to even that first set of questions, right? They're gonna have to do that background legwork. And then the first set of questions, the reason they're divided by names is really just to sort of really help the students identify that. Make sure you've mastered these concepts before you move on to the next level, right? And once you have, and once we feel like you've got that foundation, now let's work on more advanced problems. And that's where you get to the bridge problems. And that's where sort of the scaffolding comes in, that sort of we're building in along the way, and working towards more advanced work, more advanced concepts. And when you come to that live class session, you've done a significant amount of legwork, and it allows for, in the live session, not only this opportunity to ask questions and engage on things that the individual student may have struggled with, but from the professor's standpoint, sort of we come ready knowing that everyone's sort of primed for this deeper, richer discussion and analysis. It allows us to sort of capstone and wrap up the week, make sure that everybody's on the same page on this sort of the core foundational principles and concepts we want everyone to get out of that week, work with some of the material more, taking it sometimes to sort of a more advanced level to sort of show what's out there, what the possibilities are, and then having, again, sort of that opportunity to sort of wrap everything up and make sure that the class as a whole is, where it needs to be, where it wants to be ready to then move into the next phase of the weekly, the weekly schedule, which is to take a weekly assessment, which again, we only usually count depending on the professor. I have six weekly assessments, and I count the top 4 highest grades, right? So again, make it more low stakes, because this is more about learning and being iterative, as Professor Book noted. In which case, I would also point out that the learning doesn't stop with taking the assessment. One of the things that was also really important to us is that with each sort of like online, question, say it's a multiple choice question, that you don't just, when you go to look up your score, find out your score, what you got right or what you got wrong, but there's feedback there as well that, we have written, brief explanations for why a particular answer is correct, and sometimes why other answers, were not correct, so that if you didn't get something right, you have that opportunity to continue to learn and grow from that, review that explanation. And then once again, if you have follow-up after that, I've certainly had students, even after reviewing the explanations, reach out to me and have further discussion. Because I think one of the things that, we recognize, and I think is so important, is that, I've just encountered over and over again, students in our program they're not taking the classes to earn a grade. They're taking the classes to develop their skills and knowledge, right? That's the goal. That's sort of the big picture goal and objective they have in working towards their degree. And it's so important to us to help them meet that goal and objective of theirs. And so there's, a good bit of engagement. And I think, going back to your question, that's a lot of what goes into thinking about how to develop the class, what skills and knowledge do our students need, and how do we get them from sort of the starting point to the end goal in a way that makes sense, in a way that sort of breaks things up, gives pauses, has these opportunities for check-ins to make sure that someone's not getting lost along the way and stays on track to meeting their goals.
Thank you so much for walking us through that, Professor Moline. I know on my end of things, I've often heard from students who say how valuable the feedback is that you and Professor Book and Professor Harvey created. You're right, our students are often saying they want the knowledge, they want the skills. Obviously they want to do well, but more importantly, they want to walk away with, hard learning principles that they're gaining from your classes. So thank you for walking us through that. I'm going to stop sharing just so everyone can see our presenters more clearly. And Professor Harvey, I'm going to pivot over to you. I know that you meticulously review your course to keep it refreshed. You teach it 3 times a year. It's by no means stagnant. You're always checking in and adding things to it as it's needed. And I know that has been especially a daunting task when legislation is changing, given the expansive content that falls into survey of text. Could you talk about how the course has evolved over the years, and how you choose topics to cover, and then how you connect with your online students in covering those topics?
Sure, I can do that. Well, certainly the basic concepts that exist in some of the different areas are very similar from year to year. The question becomes, how do I illustrate some of those basic concepts? Like, for example, in the state and local tax area, one of the key concepts in state and local tax is so-called Nexus. And does a particular taxpayer have Nexus, which means a sufficient connection with the state in order for that state to be able to tax them? And so I want to illustrate, I want to discuss Nexus every year. What changes from year to year is how I discuss it. And for example, for several years, one of the big Nexus questions surrounded sales and use tax collection, and it ultimately resulted in a Supreme Court case, the so-called Wayfair case. And that was a great case. It was a live case working its way through the courts that we had the opportunity to discuss, and then ultimately see how the Supreme Court ruled. They ruled 5-4 on that particular issue. So that's one example. Now, since that decision is now 3.5 years old, Now I still discuss that decision, but now I'll talk a lot about people working remotely and telecommuting, which has become a huge issue. I suspect most every student, as well as every person, all the professors here have telecommuted over the last several, 2 years that the pandemic has been on. So again, that's the situation where the question becomes, when does someone have sufficient nexus with a particular state? So I will use current events to try and illustrate some of the basic concepts. So that's how it changes from year to year. It depends what the current events might be. Now, I think, what was the second part of your question?
I was just wondering if you could talk about, how you connect with your online students in covering your topics.
Well, I think I connect with them in several different ways. Obviously, there's the live session every Thursday night. A discussion board is one of the ways in my class that I connect very significantly with students, because I'm actively involved in a discussion board going back and forth with students. And I think the other way that try and get students interested is if you're talking about real live issues, such as the ones I just spoke about, whether it be the Wayfair case, or whether it be telecommuting, or whether it be in the international arena now, the OECD is looking to radically change how Nexus is determined in the international context. When one's dealing with current topics like that, where you can go in and see in major publications that it's being discussed on the front page or the second page of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, or it's being discussed every week in tax notes or the daily tax report, I think that gets students excited, because they understand that we're not just discussing something that's abstract and they may or may not get a chance to deal with it during their career. We're dealing with real live issues that currently exist in the tax world.
Thank you. And again, that's the feedback I've heard from students who take your class as well. And I know that the survey of tax allows them a chance to really delve in first time to a lot of areas of tax that they aren't practicing in, and having those real world topics, I think, is clinch for getting their buy-in to the rest of the program ahead. So thank you very much for sharing that. Professor Book, talking about our core courses, we've talked about a few of them now. You also teach our professional practice and tax procedure course that you've designed. When you were designing that course, because it's required for both our lawyers and non-lawyers, could you talk about your approach in creating paths for them to equally make learning goals?
Yeah, and this is an area that tax procedure is an area of deep interest of mine, and I have created and a principal contributor on a national tax procedure blog, and I'm a successor author on a tax treatise dedicated to practice and procedure before the IRS. And my approach to it was that while this is an area where I spend a lot of time, and this is my kind of world, most students in our program are not tax controversy practitioners. But the starting point I had was that there is a fundamental need for all practitioners to understand the relationship between taxpayers and the IRS. And that relationship I divided into two kind of main kind of baskets. One is the ways in which the IRS communicates guidance and law in various forms, the form of regulations or sub-regulatory guidance, kind of more generally. And then secondly, I looked at the relationship between taxpayers and the IRS from the standpoint of from filing to collection, and taking a holistic approach to the relationship between taxpayers, whether they be individuals, whether they be business entities, whether they be trusts, and how they may interact with the IRS. And then finally, but not least in terms of importance, took a perspective of the importance of focusing on a practitioner's responsibilities to practice ethically before the IRS, whether it be an attorney or an accountant. And I started with those approaches, those main areas. And then I said, well, what do we need? what do students, whether they be lawyers or accountants, what should all tax practitioners have experience with and understanding of? And so I started from that point, and then I built down, as Professor Mullane identified. We build specific units, we build learning objectives around those units. We all of our classes have a unique feel, a template, this notion of foundation questions, bridge problems, weekly live sessions, graded assessments, feedback from the assessments, and the class fits that mold. And like Professor Harvey, one of the things that I bring to the table in this course is I'm very involved with current developments. And so things that are of significant current interest for practitioners. For example, the IRS's desire to get at the identity of investors in cryptocurrencies, a hot issue generally and a super hot issue in procedure. And so I'll bring in those issues throughout the course to make it, to kind of supplement the more general procedure principles that many other programs and other classes have. So that's my approach, and again, I think the feedback we've gotten is that practitioners appreciate this, again, even without their necessarily having a focus or a professional, dedicated professional approach to practice and procedure.
Absolutely, and I agree. I've heard the same from students. This is really the only opportunity many of them have in their career, because they don't receive this, type of procedural training necessarily on the job training. And so it does flush out their skills as tax practitioners, which is why I think it's been critical to have it as a part of our core curriculum. So Professor Mullane, I will pivot to you. Pivot, still my new word from the pandemic, I guess. And you and I have talked about this a lot, that I've seen firsthand, the lasting relationships you have built with many of our students, particularly, of course, your in-person students, but also your online students over the years, many of whom have never been able to travel to campus, due to distance and where they live. Could you speak to how you have built that engagement with your students in your classes that has really paid dividends then in having such strong rapport with them?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is, this is critically important. And, I'll go even broader and say, I think that, it really matters to everyone teaching in the program, not just my full-time colleagues here on this, webinar with me, but our adjuncts as well. And that's one of the reasons that we're so committed to the live session, is because of our commitment to sort of engaging directly with our students and to build relationships. And I think that we all go about this in a variety of ways to help our students feel connected to us and to the program. And some of our faculty are very active on the discussion board, and Professor Harvey is, my idol in that regard, who's significantly more engaged on discussion board than I am. Professor Book and I have talked a lot about different ways of engaging with the students in our classroom. And I think it's varied over time, and I think sometimes it depends on the nature of the class dynamic that I particularly have. Sometimes we, will assign a point person to work on a problem that we're going to discuss that night, in advance, but then we meet with them before class, that night and sort of talk to them and work with them sort of one-on-one. Other times it's just really heavy emphasis on, engaging during the class session, and making sure that everybody knows that, yes, we want you to raise your hands and ask questions, and sometimes creating hypotheticals that really require our students to engage with each other and then with us. Oftentimes it really is as simple for me as logging on to class 15 minutes before class starts, because other people are there. They want to make sure that they can get in. They're chatting with each other. They see that I'm there. They start chatting with me. That's not even necessarily about about class that night, that it's a little bit more informal, maybe a little bit more than weather. This time of year in particular, it's a lot about basketball, but to start building those relationships. Sometimes, with a more modest class size, I've done this as well. I've tried to schedule, within the first couple of weeks, brief and not necessarily not a requirement for a grade, but certainly if anyone who wants to, sort of little individual like Zoom calls, conference calls, like, I want everyone to have an opportunity to really just sort of connect with me directly. And I have gone through the process of just making sure, whether it's day, night, weekends, whatever works with the student, that we have an opportunity to just touch base and just talk about what their goals are in the program and their goals with this class, and and build relationships that way. And so it varies from class to class, professor to professor, but I think in general there's a variety of ways that those who are committed to really building connections with their professors that were available, and for the professors who want those connections with their students, which I think is pretty universal in our program, and again sort of really unique, we're putting ourselves out there. And like so much, it's what do you want out of it, right? If you want that connection, then you will find professors who are willing to connect. And if you for whatever reasons, and there's no right or wrong here, like you're at a point in life where you don't have necessarily the time to spend on that, you don't have to either. But there's a variety of ways to connect in the live sessions and outside of the live sessions, with professors and with students, and start building those relationships. And when it does really take hold, or there's a natural alignment of interests and work, I think that we've all seen opportunities for that to continue, those relationships to continue well beyond when the class ends and well beyond when they graduate from the program.
Thank you so much for walking through. Yeah, it's I agree with you. I think that is such a great component of our live sessions, and you can take what you want from it as a student. I think that is a real reason why it's a differentiator for our program, is that oftentimes with asynchronous programs, you're sort of self-paced learning, and you don't have that opportunity to chat with your peers as much as with your professors. And so the live sessions really are the hallmark of our program, and then can lead to establishing long-term rapport and connections, as you've shared, Professor Moline.
And I'll also jump in to sort of pivot, to use your word, pivot off that in a different direction and say, something else that, I've really been trying to build, and we've had discussions of this as well, is, a real community amongst the student body. And so again, I've seen this, sometimes flourish, sometimes flounder, and depending on, where the students are at and what they want out of what's going on at that particular point in time. But, there have been some classes where I encourage students, if they have the time, to sort of have online, virtual sort of study sessions, or to continue their conversations, whether it's on discussion board or outside of discussion board. And so some classes have had, virtual meetups directly following my live session that, that I'm not a part of, so they can sort of discuss amongst themselves, and decide where they want to follow up with me or not. And we're sort of working as well, whether it's connected to the class or connected to sort of other types of events, ways to continue to build community, not just between students and professors, but, a community writ large, community with your peers, and have more of these opportunities to build those relationships that, again, will continue to flourish beyond the program. I'm often telling my students, like, it's really great to build relationships if you're on the East Coast with someone on the West Coast, because, yes, certainly in the last couple of years, and even before then, we have all these ways of communicating, but it's great if someone, personally, who's just sort of outside of your more sort of traditional, for lack of a better way of putting it, sort of thought bubble, like the people that you're always talking with. To get different perspectives, you sort of have to reach outside of sometimes your immediate community, where you're certainly discussing things, but maybe they're having just different types of discussions on that sort of on the West Coast, and there's more opportunity to go to sort of these national conferences, but to just sort of call up your colleague from the program and say, hey, I know you deal in the same area. I'm dealing with this issue. What are you guys talking about? What are you thinking? And to sort of continue to build these types of relationships.
Agreed. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I am being mindful of time, so I'm going to ask each of our panelists just one more question before we wrap up. So Professor Harvey, I'll go back to you. You've been teaching in the program, both ground and online, for I think over a decade now. And I was wondering if you could share the practices you've seen from students that has set them up for success in your course and then likely beyond.
Well, I think the key things are, because these are such short courses from a time perspective, you don't want to fall behind. So you want to hit the ground running. If you fall behind, you might never catch up. So that would be my first piece of advice to students. The second piece is certainly for my class would be to make sure you look at the sample questions and suggested answers before you actually submit your graded assignments, because that's a good roadmap for how you go about actually answering the graded assignments. And then lastly, of a more general nature, and I guess building on what Professor Mullane was just speaking about, I would urge students to get to know as many of their fellow students as possible, because it's not just geography, it's specific areas of expertise. And let's say I'm an individual tax professional, and all of a sudden I've got an estate tax issue. Well, there are going to be students in the class that focus solely on estate taxes. And you're going to want to maybe call them up and say, hey, Joe, or hey, Mary, have you run across this issue or can you help? And vice versa. So, understanding what your other students' areas of expertise could be very important for future career in building relationships with those sort of expert or those sort of professionals that maybe you're not expert in that particular area.
Great, thank you for sharing those recommendations for our future students. Professor Book, I'll move to you. As you and Professor Mullane shared, when you created this pedagogy that active learners, do best, which means interaction is a key component in your classes and all of your classes, both your JD classes, I know, and your tax classes. Could you talk about how you promote engagement in your classes for those listening?
Sure. Yeah. In addition to some of the things that Professor Mullane said in terms of being available, one of the things I tried to do in our live sessions is to be present both before and after class if students have additional material or questions or things they want to discuss. But what I've done and have evolved over time in terms of I think a better use of the synchronous or the live class session, which is that's a primary feature of our program. We really work hard to ensure that it's kind of integrated with the asynchronous content, with the questions and the problems. And what I've done to kind of maximize engagement is I think it is evolved into a better use of that class time to build on or build off of the work that the students have done coming into the class. As Professor Mullane said, one of the joys as a teacher in this program is that you can expect that most students will have come to the class session having done kind of, the table has been set. And you could really use the class time to build on and have engaging discussions and problems that kind of jump off of the work that students have done. And what that does is, as Professor Mullane and Professor Harvey have emphasized, it makes our program more active and dynamic. And certainly I think my class time has become more active and dynamic because the class session jumps off the work in a way that I didn't fully appreciate, I think, when I first started teaching in the online program. And I think that has, helped ensure that the students are, I don't want to say necessarily always excited about class time, because, but it's a time that I think can be worthwhile and engaging in a way that sometimes classes may not always be.
Thank you for sharing that. And Professor Mullane, I'll pivot to you for the final time. I think everyone is getting a sense, of course, that our tax curriculum is challenging, rigorous. There's support for you, but it is a challenging program. We recognize that balancing it with work family life can be stressful at times. Could you talk about how you've advised and counseled students when they have hit an obstacle in their degree progression?
Sure. I mean, there's a number of obstacles that, students can encounter. And life certainly happens along the way. I mean, you're going through a program for a couple of years, things come up, and we've seen a number of things come up. And so I counsel from a variety of perspectives. And, I mean, just sort of a core tip, so to speak, in general, is always just to sort of really try to block out time. I would say we hear this time and time again from students and alums that those who felt like they went through sort of most successfully is to have a dedicated time where it's sort of on the schedule, and to really have that and have that work with your natural, whatever your natural rhythm, daily rhythm or weekly rhythm is. And then another sort of key component is to whoever is in your external space, your support system, that they're on board and that they know sort of what you're going through and can help support you through the process. And there's a few key things that I would say. One of the things that we like to emphasize more and more is that if along the way, you hit any kind of speed bump in your life, reach out to us early and often, because we will try, again, every situation is so unique, but we will try to do whatever we can to sort of to work with students to help them get where they need to be. Both the full-time staff and the full-time professors I've seen over and over are willing to be, within the constraints that the university sets, as accommodating as we possibly can be, and working with students who have, whatever unique circumstances come up. So, it's hard from the perspective of, I can't say it's one size fits all. Sometimes it's someone who's struggling just because of time management, and we talk about that. Sometimes they're struggling just because this is a very different format than they're used to, and they may need to learn different types of study skills, and we'll talk about that. And sometimes just something has come up in their life and they need a little bit of flexibility with the program, and we will find ways to sort of work that in. I know that one of the things, Megan, that you will say often is that we frequently, we have these standard final exam times, but we have a very generous policy for rescheduling the exams because you have some sort of work-life conflict that we can sort of reschedule it on another day later that week. Again, we have some constraints built in by the university, but I've seen time and time again, professors willing to be accommodating, professors willing to, as Professor Brook was just saying, like, he'll stay after class to talk with students who are willing to, again, work outside of class if a student's struggling with a particular concept or just struggling with a particular subject matter, right? Maybe they're great at SALT, but they're struggling at corporate tax. And our professors are willing to put in the extra effort to find out where the problem is and to help resolve it. And so I would say that the counseling and advising is very individual, but the thing that is standard is a willingness to work with the student to, again, sort of try to help them achieve their goals, because that's what we want. We care about this. Also universal, I would say, in full-time, and our adjunct faculty is just so committed to and wanting to give back to tax professionals in the way, particular adjuncts who work full-time, right? They're doing this because they want to give back to the next generation. And so there's a commitment to wanting to see our students be successful in reaching their goals. And we try to be as accommodating as we can be, and as helpful as we can be.
Thank you so much for walking through that with everyone. And it's a great note to close on, to hear that message. I'm going to quickly share the slides again, just so I can highlight our admissions timeframes. We've already mentioned this, and I'm not going to read off our slide, but we start 3 times a year. We run our core classes 3 times a year. We have many electives that run very frequently, 2 to 3 times a year as well, so that we can meet students where they are. We have a rolling admission decision, typically within 10 business days of receiving full completed applications. And for those of you who are interested, you're likely already working with my colleague, Tim Dinan, who's been kindly on here monitoring our webinar. But should you want more information, here's my email as well as Professor Mullane's. And I'm going to pass it back to Professor Mullane to close out, but I do want to stress that we talked a lot about academic excellence today. And I hope you see that the academic excellence really starts with our expert faculty that we have here. We're very fortunate to have full-time faculty in our program, full-time faculty who also teach in our JD program. And that makes Villanova very unique. And I hope that you heard that message today and have seen just what top-notch instructors you're going to have in our program. So thank you all for listening, and Professor Mullane, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you. And mindful of time, I will just, reiterate, thank you for spending time with us today. And please do feel free to reach out if you have any follow-up questions or want to discuss anything about the graduate tax program further.
Wonderful. And thank you, all of our professors, Professor Harvey, Professor Book, Professor Mullane. Thank you for your time today, and take care, everyone.